What is the most horrifying fact you know? Story 1. Japanese human experimentation during World War II. To determine the treatment of frostbite, prisoners were taken outside in freezing weather and left with exposed arms, periodically drenched in water until frozen solid. The arm was later amputated. The doctor would repeat the process on the wounded person's upper arm to the shoulder. After both arms were gone, the doctors moved on to the legs until only a head torso remained. The victim was then used for plague and pathogens experiments. Story 2. At any time, one of the proteins in your brain can misfold and cause a prion disease, and we don't know why. Prions are so difficult to destroy that after autopsy all equipment has to be destroyed. Edit. They're not contagious, but most normal sterilization techniques will remove them 100%. Second edit. It's not that dead people get infected. It's that anything that comes into contact with the prions probably won't be 100% decontaminated before it comes into contact with a live person at a later, even much later, time. Disinfectant procedures used for viral, bacterial, and fungal pathogens such as alcohol boiling, formalin, dry heat, 300 degrees Celsius, autoclaving at 120 degrees Celsius for 15 minutes, and ionizing ultraviolet or microwave radiation are either ineffective or variably effective against aggregated prions. Story 3. As a geology student, I just learned that we are losing more topsoil than what is being produced. Soil takes at least 2,000 years to produce efficiently, and usually at 10,000 years for some parts of the world. Soil is what sustains us, our animals, and life on Earth. It's just as important as sunlight and water. Story 4. After the atomic bomb was dropped, there were some people who were close enough to have their faces melted but not killed. So for a few days before they died of dehydration, they wandered around moaning with their mouths melted shut. I read a recent post on Reddit that said that the blast was so inefficient that it converted less than 10% of the uranium mass into energy. The rest was blasted apart into microscopic particles as fallout. It's terrifying to think that an atomic bomb that had a very small yield of around 14 kilotons was so destructive it flattened a big city and killed hundreds of thousands of people, yet it was only around 10% efficient. Story 5. The bystander effect. The probability of a person in need getting help is inversely proportional to the number of people in the vicinity. An example of this is a car accident. The more people are around, the less likely it is that the victim will receive help. This is because each individual assumes someone else will do it. This is in contrary to what we'd think would happen. Story 6. According to the writings of Valerius Maximus and Florus, the king of the Teutons, Teutobod was taken in the irons after the Teutonists were defeated by the Romans. Under the conditions of the surrender, 300 married women were to be handed over as Roman slaves. When the matrons and the Teutons heard of this stipulation, they begged the consul that they might instead be allowed to minister in the temples of Ceres and Venus. When their request was denied, the Teutonic women slew their own children. The next morning, all the women were found dead in each other's arms, having strangled each other during the night. This act passed into Roman legends of Teutonic fury. Story 7. The Cascadia subduction zone is long overdue for a rupture. When it does go, it's going to fuck shit up. Everything west of I-5 from far northern California to southern British Columbia is going to have a really rough time. Seismologists and geologists are laying odds on what is happening within the next 50 years. This region is woefully unprepared to deal with the initial earthquake and tsunami, or the aftermath. This is going to make Katrina look like a day in the park. Story 8. There was a guy, and he had a tapeworm, and the tapeworm had cancer, and the cancer metastasized. And the worm's cancer cells frolicked all through the guy's body and took root and grew tumors in his lungs. And the tumors weren't made of human cells, they were masses of worm flesh. Then he died. Story 9. An ancient warrior and devastating general in the 14th century, Timur and Tamerlane, died at the age of 68. And inscribed on his tomb were the words, "When I rise from the dead, the world shall tremble," and "Whoever disturbs my tomb will unleash an invader more terrible than I." Joseph Stalin ordered the tomb to be opened June 20th, 1941. And exactly 2 days later, on June 22nd, 1941, Adolf Hitler launches Operation Barbarossa and begins to invade the Soviet Union. This legend is called Tamerlane's Curse. Story 10. I'm an aerospace materials engineer, and this is my favorite horrifying fact for people scared of flying. The melting temperature of the turbine blades in a jet engine is around 16,000 K, and the temperature of the gas stream the blades operate in can exceed 1,800 K. The only thing stopping the blades from melting and causing catastrophic failure of the engine is a minuscule layer of cool air. In this context, cool is around 700 to 800 K, pumped out of tiny air holes to create a thermal boundary layer. Story 11. With almost 12,000 comments, it's bound to be listed in some form here because it is truly the most disgusting and horrific thing I've ever heard of. But the Battle of Verdun and World War I, there were people who died in shell craters full of toxic chemicals. This happened not because they were injured or disabled, but because scaling the sides was impossible due to all the human fat, blood, and excrement that had been saturated the ground. I cannot even begin to imagine how horrible it must have been to die like that. Story 12. There are more slaves right now than there ever were in the US. Worldwide, there are 25+ million slaves. That's almost the entire population of Canada. Edit. I am aware that the population of Canada is 35+ million. The comparison gives you a rough idea of the scale. There's no registry, and the estimates are between 21 million and, holy shit, 46 million. Wow. And right now, there are slaves in the US and Canada. There are sex slaves working in Vancouver today. There are child slaves overseas harvesting shrimp, pineapple, tea, coffee, and chocolate. Odds are very, very high that you used something made by a child slave today. Story 13. There are factories in China where the owners have under-the-table deals with local schools to bring their kids into work half a day. These kids don't know any better. They're just doing what their teachers tell them. They don't have any training to be in these factories, so accidents happen often around the big machinery. These kids are losing hands or entire arms in these accidents. The factories are making children's toys and are protected by the major toy company. The toy company employs major law firms to help them cover up the children who are being maimed to make these toys. So your kids' toys might have been handled by a child in China who ended up maimed for life, confused at why they got hurt when all they did was listen to their teacher. Source. An old friend of mine was working for one of the law firms and was having a mental breakdown because they were tasked to find all the evidence, pictures, etc., of maimed factory children and destroy them. Story 14. Most artificial intelligence researchers, thinkers, and philosophers believe that artificial superintelligence is likely to be achieved within the lifetime of people who are young today. Most of these people also believe that it will be the last invention we will make, either because we work up the absolute most magically best recipe for machine intelligence that has their best interests in mind and brings us as individuals and a civilization to veritable immortality, or because, for any of a very long list of reasons, we create a superintelligence that rationalizes that humans are a strategic threat or just unimportant and in the way of its goal, and our species is quickly wiped out. Quickly, i.e., one day, all the humans died. Oh, and by the way, many AI researchers/thinkers think that while it will take a few decades to create a machine intelligence on par with a human, that the time between that milestone and the birth of superintelligence that is capable of controlling virtually everything on this planet could be on the order of minutes or hours. Story 15. There are multiple people sitting in jail who we know did not commit the crimes they are accused of. At least one has even been put to death. And many more than that are forever ex-felons and have lost their right to vote, along with a plethora of other things, and we, society, the legal system, etc., know that they didn't commit the crime. Story 16. Thinking World War II, we remember Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombs. Bombing of Tokyo was even worse. An aerial armada of 334 B-29 bombers took off from newly established bases in the Mariana Islands, bound for Tokyo. In the space of a few hours, they dropped 1,667 tons of napalm-filmed incendiary bombs on the Japanese capital, eliminating more than 100,000 people in a single strike, and injuring several times that number. It was the highest death toll of any air raid during the war, including Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By comparison, the bombing of Dresden a month earlier had resulted in around 25,000 deaths. Story 17. Parasites don't just passively sit there draining their hosts' nutrients. They can actively change the behavior and sometimes physical traits of their hosts. For example, one type of parasite causes the fish they inhabit to behave in an actively suicidal manner, intending to attract the attention of predatory birds, which in turn are a secondary host in the parasite's life cycle. They turn on their sides and wriggle at the surface of the water, flashing their bright sides of the birds above, and making them easy to catch. This isn't even a rare infection. Entire colonies of seabirds are sustained by the actions of these parasites. A predatory barnacle, Saculina, infects crabs. Seculina neuters the crab and replaces the crab's reproductive organs with its own. It then hijacks the crab and forces it to behave as a female with a ripe egg sac, whether the crab is male or female, and sends it to exposed places to spread the eggs of the parasite, putting the host at extreme risk of predation. Toxoplasmosis. The reason people say to keep pregnant women away from kitty litter is a parasite that inhabits both rodents and cats in different stages of its life cycle. This parasite, when it is time to leave the rodent host, causes the normally shy mouse or rat to suddenly become suicidally brave, walking around in broad daylight far from cover, specifically to attract predators. Humans are not immune. Toxoplasmosis infection causes psychological changes in humans too. Infected people become more foolhardy and less concerned about the risks of their actions. Wouldn't be surprised if more than one midlife crisis or extreme sporting hobby was actually the result of an infection. Story 18. Not horrifying, but more depressing. In the horse racing world, they will breed a thoroughbred and a second horse at the same time. Then when they both give birth, they give the newborn thoroughbred to horse number 2 and orphan foal to number 2, and therefore leave it to die, so the thoroughbred can breed again as soon as possible. Story 19. In a microbiology class, we were discussing viruses and their stages. The lytic stage, in which it is actively being replicated, and the lysogenic stage, in which it is embedded into the host's genome, waiting for some environmental factor that will trigger the lytic stage. The professor was telling us that it is quite possible that a portion of our own DNA, up to 6% he said, though I don't know where that number came from, could be ancient viruses, embedded into the genome of our entire species now, lumped in with so-called junk DNA, and could possibly be triggered by some factor that we could never foresee, with equally unforeseeable results. Probably nothing to worry about though. Probably. Story 20. In the 1950s, there was a massive solar flare commonly called the Carrington effect. The auroras were so bright that they could be seen in the Caribbean, and people could read the newspaper by the light in the north. The scary thing is that this caused lots of problems with telegraphs, the most advanced communication technology at the time. Besides reports of wires bursting into flames, there was apparently enough energy in the lines that they could send messages to other stations without connecting their power supply. Voice records suggest that this may happen from time to time. So if telegraph wire shorted and burned at a few inches apart, what will happen to the processor of your cell phone with its circuits only 32 millimeters apart? Story 21. There was a horrifying accident at an oil rig called the Byford Dolphin in 1983, where the pressure in a diving bell went from the pressure of 9 atmospheres to 1 in a fraction of a second, causing an explosive decompression that killed the occupants instantly. Before Googling this, be warned that the images of the dead are not pretty at all and are actually used as nightmare fuel for oil riggers to be more careful in their workplace. Story 22. Most Americans are against or constantly complain about the cost of healthcare. What they don't realize is that the US is the only developed Western country without free healthcare. Health is literally the most important thing in our lives, yet 25% of your taxes go to the military to bomb countries you couldn't even place on a map. So people are okay and actually supportive of thousands of lives elsewhere, but have a hard time paying money for their own people's health. It just blows my mind. Story 23. Millions of human beings all across the world live in absolute misery that includes starvation, slavery, and torture. And then, here we are, as a world, able to feed and provide reasonable comfort and health to the same people, but we don't. And we care, but not enough to do enough about it. Myself included. Here I sit, on my couch, watching Ballers and deciding if I want ding-dongs or ho-hos for my late-night snack while all this misery in the world happens. Oh well, ding-dongs it is. Story 24. How vulnerable our power grid is to geomagnetic disturbances, and how utilities won't upgrade to protect against it because it's expensive. We are literally one bad solar flare from losing electrical power in most of the country. Due to the lack of replacement HV transformers, some of these outages would last years. Story 25. Total global animal population is decreasing each year and second. Human race has selfishly furthered created the mass extinction with little care. Humans lay pipe for increasingly negative future human life by choosing to ignore climate change and global warming. Terribly corrupt governments around the world and people. Horrible wars and decision-making with a complete disregard for critical thinking skills. Majority of global population has little to no care about any of this because of psychological and societal bullshit and mass sheep-like herding, aka gullible and suppressive populations. I'm sure there are others, but this is pretty much up there. Story 26. Everything is constantly moving apart, but gravity keeps some things together. It keeps planets orbiting stars, stars forming galaxies, etc. All of the stuff that is gravitationally bound together this way is called a galaxy group. The galaxy group we're in is called the local group. Different galaxy groups, however, are not gravitationally bound. They're far enough apart that gravity was never able to overcome the inertia, and they're forever flying away from us. In fact, it's impossible for us to ever reach another galaxy group, no matter how much time or how advanced our technology becomes. From this point onwards, everything in the local group will forever be stuck in the local group. The other galaxy groups are just moving away from us too quickly. In fact, in the distant future, whatever sentient life happens to be around won't even know other galaxy groups exist. There won't be any detectable light from them, no cosmic background radiation, nothing. All they will ever know is the local group. I don't know why, but I find this really depressing. Story 27. The only reason they clip pigs' tails is because it makes them more sensitive. So they pack too many pigs in a tiny stall and the pigs start gnawing at each other's tails. This can lead to nasty infections. So they dock the tails so they're sensitive so the pigs will react to other pigs gnawing on their tails. If the pigs are put into appropriately sized pens, this never becomes an issue. It's only an issue because these mega farms that do whatever they can to cut corners and maximize profit. So rather than give them little more space, they dock their tails. Story 28. Naegleria fowleri. It's a pathogenic amoeba that resides in lake water and occasionally is found in tap water. Sometimes it's splashed into your nose and travels up into your brain where it turns into cottage cheese. The disease it causes is called primarily amoebic meningoencephalitis. Story 29. When the Department of Homeland Defense tested the TSA, they failed to stop 67 out of the 70 undercover agents from smuggling through weapons and other prohibited items, including a fake bomb. That's a 96% failure rate. But remember, flying is still the safest way to travel. Story 30. That there is a solar flare that has our name on it. We have no way to predict it, and if we were hit by another Carrington event, level storm, with our current reliance on technology, over 1 billion would die in the first 2 years after it. It would take us a decade in the first world nation like ours to rebuild, and we would lose 3/4 of all current active satellites in orbit. The world economy would implode and mass starvation and war would ensue. They estimate about 75 million of the US dead of starvation in the first year, and almost nobody knows how close we came to it just a couple years ago from completely eating it. Congress took up the task of seeing if interrupters could be added to our grid to prevent this from happening and protect us from a localized EMP such as a terror attack. Story 31. The Brazen Bull, Bronze Bull, or Sicilian Bull was a torture and execution device designed in ancient Greece. According to Diodorus Siculus, recounting the story in Bibliotheca Historica, Perillus in Athens invented and proposed it to Phalaris, the tyrant of Acragas, Sicily, as a new means of executing criminals. The bull was made entirely of bronze, hollow, with a door on one side. The bull was in the form and size of an actual bull and had an acoustic apparatus that converted screams into the sound of a bull. The condemned were locked in the device and a fire was set under it, heating the metal until the person inside was roasted. This is seriously the most terrifying thing ever to me. The fact that it's such a small space in pitch darkness, combined with the fact that I imagine this being an incredibly slow process, actually keeps me up at night. I'm a believer in reincarnation, so sometimes I think, what if in a past life I did something horrible and was executed this way? Then I'm normally relieved with the fact that even if it did happen in the past, we're past that age in history where this wouldn't happen. Then I think, what if reincarnation isn't a straight line, but parallel lines? And then I stay up and continue freaking out. Story 32. There is an active coal mine fire that has been going on for 75 plus years in Centralia, Pennsylvania. Its zip code was revoked. No one lives there. There is steam that seeps from the ground and there's nothing being done about it for the fact that any part of the area can collapse like in the movie Silent Hill, and there would be a pit you'd just fall into.